So one of the most frustrating things people oftentimes experience is hooking up their models to their transmitter for the first time. Today we're going to be showing you how to hook up the elevator, rudder, throttle, and ailerons to your receiver, which is going to give you control. And along with that, we're going to show you how to make sure that your controls are moving in the right directions. So we're going to go through our four main inputs here. The first one's going to be our aileron. Notice that we have what we call a Y harness. This Y harness is going to take our left aileron and our right aileron, and it's going to connect those signals to one signal wire here that's going to go into our receiver. We also have our rudder, our elevator, and our throttle. Now this here is called a receiver, and what the receiver does is it takes the controls from the transmitter and it receives it and then takes that to the servos, which controls your controls up and down. Now every receiver has something that we call channel mapping. Channel mapping is simply what control goes into what servo port here. You're going to notice that there's number 1, 2, 3, and 4. This is a 4-channel receiver, basically the most simple receiver that you can get. And channel 1 on Spectrum specifically is throttle, channel 2 is your aileron, channel 3 is your elevator, and channel 4 is your rudder. There's also a signal pin that you're going to want to make sure that you line up. In this case, the signal pin is on the very top, and it's hard to see, but it's actually etched into plastic at the very top pin. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our throttle, we're going to make sure our signal wire, which is our orange or our white wire, and we're going to line it up with number 1, and we're going to plug it in. Always make sure that your signal wires are lined up and your ground wires are lined up. The red is in the middle, so you can't get that backwards. Our next is going to be our ailerons. We'll plug that in. Channel 3 is going to be our elevator. And channel 4 is going to be our rudder. Now it's really important whenever you have your transmitter receiver, whether it's Spectrum, whether it's FR Sky, always check the manual to make sure that the channel mapping is exactly the same as how you plug it in. Now this radio is already bound. If you haven't bound it before, every radio is a little bit different. We simply hold down the bind button while pressing down the bind button on the transmitter and powering it on. But again, for FR Sky, Futaba, they're all going to be different, so make sure you check your manual for this. This is already pre-bound, so our next step here is without a prop, we're going to power this on. Alright, it's really important not to have your prop on, because if you accidentally have something reversed or you bump something, you can cause damage to yourself or others. Once we have this powered up, I'm simply going to move all the controls to make sure that my aileron controls my aileron, elevator, elevator, rudder, rudder, and throttle, throttle. So let's do aileron, let's do elevator, rudder, and finally throttle. Once we cycled all of our controls to make sure all the inputs work, we're now going to check to make sure they work in the proper direction. So for the ailerons, I'm going to move my right stick to the right, and we want to confirm that the right aileron goes up. Alright, so the right aileron went down, we're going to need to reverse that. Now we're going to check our elevator. When we pull back on the stick, the elevator should go up, and in this model, it should flash green. And that's correct. Finally, we're going to check our rudder. We're going to move our rudder stick to the right, and what we should see is the rudder follow the direction of the stick and move to the right. And that's wrong. So what we need to do now is we need to reverse both our aileron and our rudder. To do so specifically on the Spectrum, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go to servo setup. I'm going to scroll over, I'm going to highlight travel, and I'm going to roll until I see reverse. There we go. Now we need to go ahead and reverse our aileron. So we'll go to aileron, we'll press the button. Now when we move our aileron stick to the right, our right aileron goes up, and that's exactly what we want. We're going to do the same process now for the rudder. And when I move my rudder to the right, it now goes the proper direction. We're going to do the same process now for the elevator. Now you may notice that some of our controls here are not quite centered, mainly our rudder here. So I'm going to go ahead and back out of that now that all of our controls work properly. And I'm going to go enter back in the servo setup. I'm going to go to something called sub-trim. Sub-trim basically does what your normal trims do, but it keeps you having the ability to adjust your trims in flight, fully left and fully right. The idea before you take this up for your first flight is you want to go ahead and trim out everything totally neutral. So for this, I'm going to go ahead and roll this over to sub-trim. I'm going to highlight rudder, I'm going to click it, and now I'm going to scroll over until the rudder's centered. There we go, that looks great. Now anytime we can do this mechanically through our push rods or our control horns, we want to do that. When we have to do this through the transmitter, sometimes we'll compromise on the resolution, basically the deflection that the right and left can go. But for this case, it wasn't too bad, so it's very easy to use your sub trims to correct this. Once we have that, we'll go ahead and hit the back button out, and we'll go ahead and check our throws one more time. That's good, elevator's good, and ailerons are good. Now, in the previous video, we've already checked to make sure the direction of the motor is running properly. In this case, because it's pushing through the air, you typically want the motor to run counterclockwise. Keep in mind, whenever you're looking at the controls of your ailerons or elevator or rudder, you want to be acting and looking at it from the perspective as if you're flying in the cockpit. But whenever you're looking at the rotation of the propeller, you want to be facing it as if you're propping a real airplane. Now, just because all of our controls are moving in the proper direction, there's one last thing that we want to check, and this is the throw. This is a deflection, in other words, that the controls have. A lot of times people think more throw means more control, but oftentimes it can cause the plane to fly poorly. Typically with flight tests, our control throw is going to be between 12 and 16 degrees depending on your skill level as a pilot. Now, specifically with the more advanced planes, you're going to be adjusting your control throws to the type of style of flying that you like to do. Now, if you follow the build videos for them, oftentimes we'll reference the control throws, and if you have this where the deflection maybe is too much or too little, you can actually increase or decrease your throws by adjusting your travel, or also if you want different flying experiences from fast to slow, you can use something called dual rates. To access your dual rates, we're going to scroll down to dual rates in Expo, and now at this point, we can go in and we can adjust the dual rates. Anytime we say the word rate, just think of the amount of deflection. Anytime we say expo, think about an exponential curve, basically softening the stick with the higher the number. So if we have 30% expo, the center of your stick is going to be a little bit less throw, and as you move it out, it's going to go back up to that 100. I'll go ahead and take our ailerons to 30% expo, and you'll be able to see right on the transmitter what I'm talking about. Now with 30% expo, this will take out any kind of nervous movements, but it'll keep the movements very small. But as I go out more, it'll increase it. Let me go ahead and exaggerate this a little bit for you, and I'll take it up to 75% expo so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. There we go. So with 75% expo, you can see by the time I get to 75%, it's still a very small movement, but the second I cross that 75%, boom. There's a tremendous amount of throw in the last 25% of the controls versus the first 75%. Now, a really good setup for all flight test planes is roughly 30% expo. So if you have a radio that has dual rates in expo, what I'd strongly recommend is set up 30% expo. This is just going to soften your stick, so if you have a little bit of a jittery thumb, the plane's still going to fly nice and smooth. With your rates, you're going to want to adjust your rates for high and low to roughly 16 degrees and 12 degrees, unless you're an advanced pilot and you want to adjust it to the type of flying that you want to do. I always recommend people fly for the first time with 16 and 12 degree deflection dialed in through their dual rates. Alright, so our little demo plane's pretty much set up here. Hopefully now you guys have a good understanding of how to hook up your receiver, how to go ahead and set your controls, make sure they're going in the right direction, and also how to set your control throws. Let's go ahead and continue with our build.